Welcome to our lecture. Thank you for joining us. Today is Tuesday, June 28th, 2022. I'm Steve Shields, President of Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. We welcome you all, both in person here in our lecture hall and on Zoom. We would ask all of you to be careful of the bandwidth use. So if you're in the room here tonight, there's no reason to log into Zoom and try to also watch that. And please be sure to put your phones on vibrate or some silent mode. Thank you. When we get to our question time, those of you who are on Zoom can, as you're thinking of questions, go ahead and type those in the chat box. And then when we get to question time, we can start dealing with some of those. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous patron, Asia Development Foundation, for their continued support. We also appreciate all our other many donors. Big or small, your support is welcome and needed. We're joined tonight by Professor Juhn Ahn, the author of Buddhas and Ancestors, Religion and Wealth in 14th Century Korea. His lecture deals specifically with Mongols and monarchy in Late-Goryeo and Early-Joseon Korea. During the long 14th century, which Professor Ahn says really kind of started in 1270 and goes to 1392, elite families in Goryeo continued to have debates about what was in good taste. They began to question the legitimacy and efficacy of mortuary practices, once considered virtuous and tasteful, but they began to regard this sumptuous spending as tasteless and disgraceful. So a complete sea change in their thinking. The debates about taste were inflected not only by economic transformations that took place under Mongol rule, but also growing concerns about social differentiation and ethnic identity. These developments also began to generate new debates about monarchy, the religio-political roles reserved for the patriarch of the highest-ranking elite family in Korea. This talk will offer a broad overview of those historical processes that gave rise to the debates and some key transformations that these debates made possible. Juhn Ahn is Associate Professor of Buddhist and Korean Studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and has published several other books, including Transgression in Korea, Beyond Resistance and Control, and Gong'an Collections 1, Collected Works of Korean Buddhism, Volume 7-1, the Choge Order of Korean Buddhism. His current research focuses on the economic history of Korea during the Goryeo period, reading practices in the Song Dynasty, Chan Buddhism, and the cultural history of weather and wealth during the Joseon period in Korea. RAS Korea reminds you that lecture content does not necessarily reflect the opinions of or positions of Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. After the lecture, there will be time for questions. Let's now welcome Professor Ahn.
Thank you. All right, I guess I'll share my screen.
Your screen will do, thank you.
There you go. All right, so let me just get straight to it. I'd like to first thank everyone here today and for joining me here in Zoom world for a talk on Goryeo period Korea. This, I think, is not an easy thing to do for two reasons. Zoom may offer the convenience of attending talks from the comfort of our own homes and maybe even at the Royal Asiatic Society Korea's lecture room. But it's hard not to feel like we're just staring at a screen watching a video. There's admittedly something really special about being in a room with other people and making the occasion feel like it's an occasion. I really wish I could be there with you right now. Coming to a Zoom talk like this one is also not easy for another reason. This particular talk is about people who lived many centuries ago, and it can be quite challenging to relate when we are so far removed from them. But I hope everyone is here because there's something about Korea's past that fascinates you. It certainly fascinates me, needless to say. And what I'll try to do today is to share with you some of that enthusiasm for things that transpired in Korea's distant past. Before I jump into the subject of today's talk, please allow me to also thank the Royal Asiatic Society of Korea and its current president, Reverend Steve Shields, for making this talk possible. I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to share my work with you today. All right. Jump to the next slide here. Let's now begin this journey back to the late Goryeo period by trying to answer a deceptively simple question. What does monarchy mean? Or more precisely, what did it mean in late Goryeo Korea? What monarchy meant in Korea prior to Koryo's submission to Mongol rule in the late 13th century is pretty clear. There was one king, loyal officials who served him, and also common people who were the beneficiaries of his grace. This, at least, is how monarchy was supposed to work in Korea before the Mongols. But this, of course, is not how it worked. The age of military rule made sure of that. The age of military rule began in 1170. But despite the significant weakening of monarchical power during the age of military rule in Korea, the monarchy as an institution, or to borrow the words of the historian Ernst Kantorowicz, one of the king's two bodies, the body politic, survived intact. But many things changed after Goryeo submitted to the Mongols. The meaning of monarchy was one of the things that changed. To better appreciate the novelty of this change, we need to go back to the year 1259. On the 21st of May that year, Prince Chun complied with the demands of the Mongols and left for the Mongol court in Dadu. While he was en route to see the Mongol Khan, Mongke, something truly unexpected happened. The great Khan died while personally leading an attack against the Chinese Song dynasty. The Korean Prince Chun therefore found himself in a very awkward situation. He ended up right in the middle of a messy succession struggle between the great Khan's younger brothers, Kublai and Arak-Boka. The latter, being the youngest child, had the rightful claim to the great Khan according to the principle of ultimogeniture. So in keeping with custom and Genghis Khan's law, or yasa, he convened a great assembly of nobles, or kurultai, where he was, as expected, named Great Khan. But his older brother, Kublai, refused to submit, and so we end up with a bloody succession struggle. Now, fortunately for our Prince Chun, he has an audience later that same year with Kublai. Why fortunate? Because Kublai will eventually emerge victorious and become Great Khan. And also because Kublai wanted the Goryeo court and the Goryeo prince to quickly recognize him as sovereign and Great Khan. Though he was able to defeat his younger brother, Kublai also had to worry about Kaidu, Khan of the Ogade Ulus, or Seit, who refused to recognize Kublai as Great Khan. And of course, Kublai still had to worry about the ongoing war with the Chinese Song dynasty. The Goryeo Prince Chun, in short, was very valuable. Kublai really didn't want to worry about his eastern flank, and he needed official recognition of his right to be Great Khan. There's one more reason why this meeting with Kublai proved to be incredibly fortunate. Back in Goryeo, his father, King Gojong, was still little more than a puppet king with no real power. Power was in the hands of the military ruler, Kim Jun. Unfortunately for Kublai, Kim Jun refused to recognize Mongol suzerainty and was willing to continue resistance on Ganghwa Island. But resistance at this point was really futile. The Goryeo court for obvious reasons, was suffering from chronic food shortages. Despite the efforts by Kim Jun to sit another prince on the throne, Prince Jeon will be enthroned as the new king of Goryeo upon his return to Korea. He will later acquire the temple name Wonjong. As Kublai hoped, the new Goryeo king, King Wonjong, sent an emissary to the Mongol court and announced himself to be the Great Khan's loyal subject. What then became of the military leader Kim Jun? Tensions within Goryeo leadership grew as pressure from Kublai, the Great Khan, mounted. These tensions finally erupted in 1269. In January of that year, Kim Jun found himself being assassinated. This may sound like a happy ending for the new Goryeo king, formerly known as Prince Jeon, but reality proved to be once again disappointing. As requested by the Great Khan, the king sends his son to the Mongol capital. This son will later acquire the temple name Chungnyeol, a name that denotes Korea's submission and loyalty to the Mongol Great Khan. The first character of that temple name means loyalty, literally. While the crown prince was away in the Mongol capital, military leaders who once helped the king assassinate Kim Jun decided to turn on him and seat the king's younger brother on the throne to produce yet another puppet king. The crown prince learned about this on his way back to Goryeo. At that moment, he made a critical decision. He decided to turn back and ask the Great Khan for help. And the Great Khan, Kublai, was happy to oblige. Kublai sent troops to Goryeo. As a consequence, a large part of the northern territories of Goryeo will be placed under the direct control of the Mongols. The attempt to dethrone King Wonjong will also, needless to say, come to a quick end. And as a result, monarchy in Goryeo is restored. But was it really restored? King Wonjong was still painfully aware of the weakness of the Goryeo throne on which he sat. The recent attempt to replace him with his brother painfully reminded him of this fact. Monarchy still existed in name only. High-ranking officials and military men continued to wield incredible power. They formed powerful networks through marriage and could lay claim to pedigree, which not even the king could challenge. In response, King Wonjong started a bad practice that proved to be disastrous for Goryeo. He began to reward men who remained loyal to him, men who often came from very unconventional backgrounds, such as interpreters and slaves, with wealth. They formed his inner circle. But wealth was something that the king didn't really have. Extraordinary measures were therefore taken to create wealth. Goryeo kings began to basically grant land to officials who belonged to their inner circle if they could reclaim it and bring it under the plow. Extraordinary measures had to be taken because loyalty was not what it used to be. It was now something that could, and perhaps even had to be, bought. This was not an ideal situation for King Wonjong, and he knew it. So he decided to do something about it. King Wonjong used what I'd like to call the nuclear option. The king paid the Great Khan a personal visit in 1270. Among the many things they discussed, one proved to be particularly important, at least for King Wonjong. He asked Kublai to grant his son, the crown prince, the honor of taking one of the imperial princesses as his bride. The king made the same request the following year via an emissary. His persistence paid off. Kublai approved the request. On June 23rd, 1274, a year after the suppression of the Sambyeolcho rebellion, and on the eve of the first Mongol invasion of Japan, the crown prince of Goryeo took the great Khan's daughter, Kutluk Kelmish, as his bride while serving as a hostage, or tukak, in the Mongol capital. Kublai, no doubt, saw strategic value in this marriage alliance. A few years later, the Chinese Song dynasty will finally fall, and Yuan will gain control, the Mongol Yuan dynasty will gain control of the continent. And another attempt to take Japan will also take place. That too will fail, as many of you know. So why then was this a nuclear option? In Goryeo, especially among its elites, marriage was not taken lightly. Marriage was considered key to maintaining elite status. We could perhaps argue that the king's decision to forge affinal bonds with the Mongol imperial family is consistent with this Goryeo custom, but it was in fact a risky political move in that it had no actual precedent. How then did this affect Goryeo's monarchy? Well, monarchy died, and it was replaced by something that also lacked precedent in Korea. What replaced monarchy? Something I'd like to call a bifurcated structure of rulership replaced it. Goryeo was now both the appanage of an imperial son-in-law, or kurugin, or Mongol prince, and also at the same time a kingdom with its own independent bureaucracy. The successors of King Wonjong, who continued to take Mongol princesses as their brides, were both imperial son-in-law and Goryeo king. Oddly enough, this unprecedented arrangement is reflected in the seal that Kublai forged for the ruler of Goryeo in 1281, which read, "The seal of the branch secretariat for the Eastern campaigns, son-in-law and king by imperial command." That's a lengthy title for a ruler. How then should we make sense of this rather odd arrangement? From the perspective of King Wonjong, who made this arrangement happen, the marriage alliance with the Mongols practically eliminated the threat of another military coup. The throne would be secure, or at least that is what King Wonjong thought when he approached Kublai about the matter. In a certain sense, he was right. Not long after the Mongols withdrew to the steppes after the capital was sacked by Chinese Ming forces in 1368, Goryeo generals once again assumed control of government and turned Goryeo kings into their puppets. And not surprisingly, it was a general who put an end to the Goryeo dynasty. This, of course, is General Lee Seong-ge, who eventually founded the Joseon dynasty. The Mongols thus proved to be critical to the late Goryeo monarchy. But the monarchy, as I stated earlier, was dead. What King Wonjong and his successors were able to protect for about 100 years with the support of the Mongols was not monarchy and their right to the Goryeo throne. What they were able to protect was a new institution of rulership that many Korean elites, frankly, found confusing and distasteful. The return of what the anthropologist Marshall Salins calls the stranger king is one reason why this new form of rulership, I'd like to argue, was considered so distasteful. Stranger kingdoms, as Salins points out, are found all over the world. Dynasties typically originate with a hero from elsewhere, a stranger who manifests a nature greater than the people he is destined to rule. This, in fact, is the most effective definition of sovereignty, the right to exercise arbitrary violence with impunity. We find elements of the Stranger King legend in the stories of the foundation myths of Goryeo, of the state of Kaya, of Baekje, of Shilla in Japan, and the list goes on and on. When the stranger acts like a god, and he often does, they're often born from eggs. They can shoot arrows through just about anything, kill mythical beasts, and so on, right? They also commit acts of incest. Again, the list goes on and on. The stranger acts with arbitrary impunity. What the stranger thus embodies is what Marshall Sahlins calls divine kingship. And it is precisely because he stands outside the legal order of society this way that he can constitute it. What founds the legal order obviously cannot be subject to it. Koryo's founder Wang Gun, pictured here in the slide, however, was no stranger king. So efforts were actually made to turn him into one. Foundation myths that claimed his grandfather was the son of a Tang Dynasty emperor and his grandmother the daughter of the Dragon King were fabricated for this purpose. But in general, Goryeo kings before the Mongols tended to lack divine kingship. What they practiced instead was a carefully choreographed sacred kingship, a kingship that required them to follow, to quote Sahlins, an elaborate system of restrictions, protocols, and taboos that make it extremely difficult for a sovereign to exercise that arbitrary divine power, except in very carefully circumscribed ways. When Goryeo kings did exercise divine kingship, they did so mainly through Buddhism. And Buddhism required wealth. Nothing set the king apart more effectively than the construction of a grand memorial monastery endowed with large tracts of land, arable land, storehouses full of grains and bolts of cloth, and slaves, like the monastery Hyunhwasa and Hungwangsa. This is why Goryeo kings often built memorial monasteries themselves, but forbid other elite families from doing so. In pre-Mongol Goryeo, this was the ultimate form of arbitrary impunity or sovereignty that kings could enjoy. The bifurcated structure of rulership that emerged under Mongol overlordship presented a serious challenge to the model of sacred kingship that had been practiced for centuries in Goryeo. What was practiced instead was a form of rulership where the stranger king could and did rule in both domesticated and undomesticated forms. As imperial son-in-law and Mongol prince, Goryeo rulers could exercise their divine kingship in practically unrestrained ways. And they did. They often went out hunting with their falcons. They held banquets and feasts, as a Mongol prince was expected to do. They built grand memorial monasteries without restraint, and so on and so forth. Now, as the Goryeo king, they had to remain domesticated and were still subject to the restrictions, the protocols, and taboos that defined sacred kingship. It was the fact that the stranger king could be both domesticated and undomesticated at the same time that made this new bifurcated structure of rulership so distasteful, especially to those members of the elite who deemed it necessary to adhere strictly to the model of sacred kingship that had been practiced for centuries. And eventually, these conservatives, if you will carry the day. They will help General Lee Seong-ge establish the new Joseon dynasty in 1392 and design a model of sacred kingship that gave future rulers almost no room to exercise divine power. This is often misunderstood as the advent of Neo-Confucianism in Korea. It isn't. Now, naturally, Buddhism will not get to enjoy the privileges that it took for granted during the Goryeo period as a consequence. How then was this effort to put an end to the bifurcated structure of rulership made? It began with members of the elite making an effort to change themselves, and change had become necessary. Under Koryo's new bifurcated structure of rulership, the elite class grew and became quite bloated. People who lacked pedigree and elite family credentials, having entered the officialdom as members of the king's inner circle, tried to gain elite family credentials by doing what the elites do and did. They endowed and built memorial monasteries, built affinal relations with elite families with pedigree, and began to write embellished families' histories, which was very, very important. The rise of the stranger king and the growth of his inner circle threatened to undo the Goryeo elite as a class and social group. It was in response to this threat that changes began to be made to elite behavior and elite customs. And this effort to change began with the single most important method of building elite family credentials, namely the Buddhist memorial monastery. Goryeo elites cared about Buddhism and they offered it lavish support. And it's not surprising why. Buddhism really is an amazing religion. Not only did it offer in its analysis of the mind and the imagined universe a level of sophistication that was unrivaled, but it also surreptitiously offers classifying practices that paint a convincing portrait of what makes someone virtuous, noble, saintly, and just different from others. But how the second point worked in the case of Goryeo Buddhism wasn't really clear to me until I had a chance to reread a Buddhist studies classic, Jacques Chernet's Buddhism in Chinese Society. So here's one passage that really caught my attention. In a very different milieu, that of the upper class laity, it seems that the passion for Buddhism was assimilated to a tradition of splendor and an inclination to extravagant spending, especially on behalf of ancestors. Political and economic interests, religious customs, and aesthetic tastes all converged in these prodigal displays. In the complex interplay of such dispositions, we can glimpse the reasons for the laity's passionate adherence to Buddhism. On the level of offerings and peasant contributions to banquets, as well as other types of expenditure, all of which defy the laws of rational economy, the economic is inseparable from the religious, which is highlighted in bold here on the slide. In the end, we find a general disposition to spend and to hoard, and the appearance of new needs, aesthetic, social, economic, with implications beyond the religious domain. It was Journet's perceptive analysis of Buddhism in medieval China, his insight that the economic was inseparable from the religious, that helped me understand the significance of what happened during the late Goryeo period under Mongol overlordship. And I apologize for all the text on the slides. I know that's a big taboo. Here's another passage from Journet's text that I found inspiring and puzzling at the same time. The ruling class, preoccupied by the ever precarious equilibrium between the production of primary goods and their consumption, had ulterior motives for lending their support to Buddhism, which were quite foreign to their true inclinations. Their efforts were consequently aimed at directing the movement towards their own ends. The question of decadence must be addressed. During the centuries when religious fervor was most intense, the great festivals united disparate social classes. Under the Tang dynasty, however, a new mentality, which can be qualified as commercial, began to gain ground. Avarice broke down the old system of relationships, led to the isolation of social classes, and hence undermined the very foundations of the religious movement. Now, mind you, Jacques Cherney is writing this because he is a devout Catholic, and one of his missions in life was to figure out what led to the decline of Buddhism in East Asia. And he is claiming that commerce and the commercial mindset was likely one of the candidates behind the fall of Buddhism. The new commercial mentality that Juhn Ahn mentions here is supposedly responsible for the separation of the economic and the religious, which was supposedly held together by what Juhn Ahn calls religious fervor. This fervor, he claims, explains the decadence of medieval Buddhism. Could this observation be used to understand Goryeo Buddhism's fate as well? My aim today is to show that we actually cannot. Let me try to demonstrate the relevances of Juhn Ahn's study to understanding Goryeo Buddhism by sharing with you the story of two assistant chancellors, Jun and Yuntek. In 1289, a grave was discovered by accident. That year, the National Museum of Korea received the tip that a grave located in the civilian control zone had been desecrated. The museum learned that the desecrated grave contained murals. A team was sent to investigate the grave in 1991. A stone stele located in front of the grave identified it as the burial place of the scholar official Han Sang-jil, his name appears here on the slide, the grandfather of the famed strategist and minister Han Myung-hwae. It was presumed that the second grave behind it belonged to his spouse. But this, as we'll see, was actually not the case. The two tombs are located in Seogongri, Paju, about 30 kilometers east of Kaesong and not far from Seoul. The area was known as Injun County during the Goryeo dynasty, a subsidiary county under the direct control of the capital district, Kaesongbu. If you were anybody of significance during the Goryeo period, this and also Changdan County is where you wanted to be buried. The second grave, it turns out, was Assistant Chancellor Jun's grave. As to why it is located behind Han Sang-jil's grave, that's not clear. Speculations have been made, but it does seem worth noting that Jun was Han's maternal great-grandfather. How do we know it was Jun's grave? The excavation uncovered, in addition to some exquisite murals, a 묘지명 or funerary inscription, which helped the excavation team identify the second grave as Jun's. There you go. There's the funerary inscription. The funerary inscription did, in other words, exactly what it was supposed to do. These things were inscribed on stone and placed inside a tomb, not necessarily for people to see all the time, but in case heavy rain shifts the tomb and the contents are difficult to identify, the inscriptions left on these stone tablets would help the person who identified the tomb or discovered the tomb to identify its rightful owner. The inscription and its preface give us a good sense of what mattered to Jun and his family. Kwon really wanted to see himself as a reincarnation of the great Lee Ja-yeon. He had good reason, it seems, to see himself this way. His brother was the adopted son of King Chungsun, and two granddaughters were royal consorts. Lee Ja-yeon, who lived centuries earlier, was also an infamous royal in-law. But that's not all. We learned that our Jun purposefully restored Lee Ja-yeon's memorial monastery, Chahyosa, because he believed himself to be Lee's reincarnation. There's, of course, no reason to question the sincerity of Kwon's belief, but there is, I think, more at stake here than just simple religious belief. Kwon, in fact, was not alone in his desire to build or restore a memorial monastery. His actions, in other words, fit into a larger pattern of behavior that we can easily witness in Goryeo sources. And this was behavior that was associated with good taste. With the help of Buddhism, Kwon and many like him practiced good taste, which were classifying practices that left their audience with little room to doubt that there were ways to be noble and ignoble, virtuous and unvirtuous, tasteful and tasteless. But here I'd like to really emphasize that Kwon was not practicing what Thorsten Veblen called conspicuous consumption. His decadent and lavish spending on Buddhism was not done for its own sake. Wealth wasn't spent to show off wealth. It was a religious endeavor, and religious endeavors in Goryeo expected and required wealth. What you see in the slide here are Song-era Chinese coins found in Kwon's grave. The noble were just assumed to have wealth, and obviously this was symbolic wealth, since Song coins at that time weren't the reigning currency. Now let's take a quick look at the story of our assistant chancellor, Yuntek. Though he held the same title as at the time of retirement, Yoon chose a path quite different from our Kwon-jun, who we just saw. Yuntek wasn't buried near the capital. He didn't restore a memorial monastery, and his funerary inscription makes no mention of wealth. Instead, as you can see here, it mentions his family's humble origins and his grandfather's reputation for being honest. It also says, as you can see here in bold, when I die, do not have scruples about not using Buddhist customs. Do not be wasteful. So where was Yoon buried? He was buried far in the south next to his mother. Their graves were located on what appears to be a clan gravesite. And as you can see, in lieu of a memorial monastery, the assistant chancellor and his family chose to convert a gravesite hut into a family shrine and make seasonal and annual sacrifices according to the instructions found in the Chinese thinker Zhu Xi's Jia Li, or family rituals. Simply put, the two assistant chancellors chose post-mortem paths, something that the Goryeo elite did not take lightly, that were drastically different. Although the records of Yoon and his family mention Zhu Xi's influential manual, we can't assume that the manual was why Yoon chose a different and novel postmortem path. In fact, Yoon and his family deviate quite a bit from what Zhu Xi recommends in his manual. Zhu recommends building an offering hall or sadang inside the family's residence, not a gravesite family shrine like the one that Yoon and his family built. This was clearly a problem. The fact that the gravesite shrine housed a portrait and not a spirit tablet was also clearly a problem. This was a Goryeo custom. It was also a Buddhist one. So what's going on here? Many attribute these changes to the decline of Buddhism and the growing influence of Neo-Confucianism, but I respectfully disagree. So what about Genet? Was he right? Did Goryeo Buddhists just run out of religious fervor and realize the private or commercial ends of what used to be a religious practice? Is that what happened in Goryeo? And did Buddhism decline as a consequence? Existing scholarship on Goryeo Buddhism do not tend to support a similar idea. Namely, Buddhism was the religion of aristocratic families who were corrupt. It was just a matter of time before the religious practices lost their religious purpose. But again, I respectfully disagree with this opinion. Buddhism was the reliable brush with which good taste and royal authority were drawn during the Goryeo period for centuries. So why did some members of the Goryeo elite abandon Buddhism? Some, again, argue that this was because of Buddhism's decline. The religion had grown corrupt, and the incredible wealth of this corrupt religious institution supposedly caused a financial crisis. But behind this claim, we find an unquestioned assumption. Namely, when religion and wealth come together, this can only be read as corruption. There, however, is little evidence to support this claim and its underlying assumption. Some argue that the Rankland Law of 1391 can be used as evidence of an effort to reform the corrupt Buddhist institution, but this is simply not true. The law guaranteed the original land and wealth owned by monasteries. Even in the Early-Joseon period, the laws that targeted the Buddhist establishment didn't simply confiscate its wealth and write it out of existence. After the Red Turban and Japanese pirate incursions, and the unpredictable weather patterns of the late 14th century left the government coffers empty, the new Joseon government simply tried to keep its official Buddhism-related expenditure under control. This was no suppression of Buddhism. It was just a drastic and much-needed fiscal diet. Some also point to any mention of self-critical reflection in Buddhism, a rhetorical strategy quite commonly used by Buddhists, and the involvement of non-aristocratic patrons, which is also quite common in Korean Buddhism, and take these to be evidence of actual attempts at reforming a corrupt Buddhist establishment. The eminent Goryeo period monk Jinul and his retreat society, which eventually grew into today's Songgwangsa, are a good example. But rhetoric should not be confused with evidence. In fact, Jinul's Susunsa, the monastery, and its sister monastery, Sunwonsa, soon became one of the wealthiest monasteries in Goryeo. In place of an unsubstantiated corruption argument, I would argue this: the late Goryeo fiscal crisis should be understood not as a problem rooted in Buddhism or the aristocracy, but rather as a problem rooted in the shrinkage of prebend generating land and the privatization of wealth, which took place under the rulership of the stranger king. So my argument concerning the shifting attitude towards Buddhism is simply this. I believe that certain members of the Goryeo elite began to abandon Buddhism because Buddhism could no longer define taste and nobility as it once did. And this, I think, is noteworthy because Buddhism was particularly good at defining good taste and nobility. It knew how to draw a convincing moral arc for spending or giving. Buddhism knew how to use wealth to draw a palpable and moving drama. The portraits hung in its portrait halls, we learn from Goryeo sources, could move the minds and hearts of those who gazed upon them. And needless to say, portraits weren't cheap. But the Chinese thinker Zhu Xi's offering hall, or sadang, gives us a world deprived of this drama. What we have here is a flattening of the postmortem space. Strict adherence to Zhu Xi's instructions ensured that the ancestors of families of equal social standing would occupy the same indistinguishable postmortem space. This space was no longer accessible through solemn Buddhist chants and the visual presence of the dead in their funerary portraits. Families, in other words, couldn't draw their own postmortem destinies. Why then would anyone want to do this? And as all of you know, this is still what many Koreans practice today, right, for their ancestors. I argue that the separation of religion and wealth, the religious from the economic, would make one want to do this. And this separation occurred under certain conditions, not, as Juhn argues, because of the appearance of a commercial mindset. First, under Mongol rule, the Goryeo elite was no longer synonymous with the central bureaucracy or pedigree. Men from non-traditional backgrounds, slaves, eunuchs, translators, and so on, or interpreters, acquired wealth and high status through their ties with the Mongols, and more specifically with stranger kings. What once used to be regarded as a natural extension of elite identity, namely wealth, could no longer be regarded this way. And this was a problem. The fact that wealth was being turned into a weapon against the traditional elite by the stranger king, who returned with the emergence of the bifurcated structure of rulership under Mongol overlordship, didn't help either. Wealth, indeed, was clearly a problem that had to be explained. Assistant Chancellor Jun and Yuntek, whose stories I shared earlier, were no exception. They were palace favorites and thus men with blemished credentials. In the preface to Kwon's funerary inscription, we therefore find this curious remark about wealth, which is what you see here on the slide. The people whom the world calls noble and affluent acquire nobility and wealth through merit, but lose them through lack of virtue, gain them at the beginning of their careers, but lose them at the end, and enjoy them with their bodies, but are unable to rid their minds of sorrow. Speaking of them, how can we not feel pity? The assistant chancellor was rich and noble, but he did not possess numerous concerns. And though he attained a long life, his descendants became noble and illustrious. Now, in texts like this that talk about wealth this way, and that associate with virtue and morality, this was novel. Things like this are not readily found in earlier periods, if at all. Men and women with blemished elite credentials went out of their way to more firmly establish their identities as members of the elite this way. But this changed the Goryeo elite in a subtle way. There was less emphasis on wealth and hence Buddhist customs, and more emphasis on looking for alternatives, any alternatives. The search for alternatives to Buddhism, obviously, some tried to turn to Jushi's family rituals and others to earlier classics like Zhou or the Zhou Rites, the Book of Rites. But this search for alternatives was occasioned, I believe, by the appearance of the stranger king and the separation of wealth and religion. It was not, in other words, the corruption of Buddhism or the rise of Neo-Confucianism that led some members of the Goryeo elite to search for alternatives to Buddhism. One could no longer safely assume that wealth donated to a field of merit, that is a Buddhist monastery, would seamlessly and miraculously transform into infinite merit. One could no longer assume that this use of wealth could be a legitimate way to practice good taste. Wealth was now just wealth, and religion was just religion. Opulent spending thus became conspicuous consumption. And the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope I'm keeping time.
Go ahead.
I hope that that was within the time that you gave me to.
Oh, well, too short. We could spend another half hour, I think.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
No, let's go ahead. And I've got people waving at me. Let's have questions.
Sure.
I want to say that a couple of years ago, when I found out about Dr. Ahn's book, I immediately bought a copy and read it from front to back, and just opened up a whole new perspective for me of what Goryeo was all about. So I really enjoyed that. Do we have a question on the chat box?
No questions.
No questions there. Okay. Anyone here? What question would you like to ask Dr. Ahn? Nobody can think of anything, Juhn.
Yeah, it's hard actually. I get this a lot.
Well, it's an area of history that not a lot of us know much about. We know the summary overview of Goryeo, that this really gets into some interesting specifics. Matthew, you had a question.
So you mentioned briefly the way in which during Joseon the king was far more circumscribed in his ability to exercise sovereignty. So are you basically suggesting that this is a response to what happened at the end of Goryeo?
Yes. So the easiest, I think, way to imagine the kind of change that occasioned the change in the fate of Buddhism in Korea is to think of it in terms of Goryeo kings behaving really very much like what you see in historical dramas, where the king wears his formal attire, behaves and talks in a very royal manner, right? And is really limited in terms of how he behave. He really behaves in very predictable ways. And that's really what the scholar Marshall Sahlins meant by sacred kingship. The king has an elevated position within society and even within the court. Very few people can challenge his authority, but in return, the king has to be domesticated and remain domesticated through these very carefully choreographed ways of behaving. So when, for instance, a disaster occurs, the response that the king is supposed to show, it was destined. He has to behave in a predictable way. Now, what happens after the Mongols, the marriage alliance with the Mongols is established, is that the Goryeo kings wear two crowns, so to speak. On the one hand, they're allowed to remain monarchs and kings of Goryeo with their own independent bureaucracies. So again, it is the king that you see in the historical dramas. But the king also has a second status, and the second status is totally incompatible with this other status of him as king. And this second status is that of a Mongol prince and son-in-law. Now, this really put the Goryeo sovereign in a very unique position, because the Mongols themselves have this tradition of completely separating those who belong to the Mongol ulus or community, and those were only the Mongols, and then there were everybody else who belonged to different communities. Now the Goryeo sovereign, after it forged the marriage alliance with the Mongols, had both statuses. On the one hand, as a Mongol prince, they belong to the Mongol ulus. And in fact, Goryeo kings will henceforth go to the Council of Nobles, the Kurultai, and participate in the election of the Great Khan, because they are Mongol nobles, right? But on the other hand, they're also head of the Goryeo bureaucracy, as the Goryeo king. And in that regard, they're foreigners, right? Now, it's because of this odd dual status that and this is my argument, that the Goryeo elite start to basically, feel very uncomfortable. They feel incredibly uncomfortable because the Goryeo king as Mongol prince starts to behave in ways that isn't predictable, that doesn't belong to the circumscribed space of sacred kingship anymore. And this starts to basically undermine the very notion of the elite family in Goryeo Korea. And then what I described in the talk begins to happen, where the elite starts to think about different ways to build and maintain elite status. And these different ways start to have less and less to do with Buddhism. I hope that sort of answers your question. Does it, Matthew?
Okay. I'm getting a nod, yes.
Okay, great.
Jim, there's a question in the chat box. Do you have any idea how these changes appear in the burial structures, the graves themselves, the number of platforms in front of the tumulus, the number of statues of the funerary path, etc.?
Right. So burial customs in Goryeo, and thank you for this wonderful question. The burial customs in Goryeo are actually very interesting. So we don't have that many tombs. I know that a few of my archaeologist friends have done some very interesting work on a few of the tombs that have been uncovered and excavated. And they all look remarkably similar, except the grave that I showed you, Kwonjun's tomb, which was discovered by accident, because usually they don't, the families don't allow the excavation of these tombs for obvious reasons. But Kwonjun's tomb really, I think, is consistent with what we would expect of the tomb of an elite. Now, if we just move on to textual sources, which is of course what I'm more familiar with and comfortable with, the textual sources make it very clear that the burial customs, right, they were standardized. So if you were a member of the Goryeo elite and you could afford one, the most obvious thing to do was to, number one, build or restore a memorial monastery. So basically you would have a plot of land near the capital, right? And on this plot of land, you would donate your wealth to build a grand memorial monastery, which was actually explicitly forbidden, but the elites did it anyway. And this memorial monastery would have basically within it a big portrait hall. And that portrait hall is where you made all the sacrifices, the ancestors and whatnot. Now, the memorial monastery and its portrait hall would be located right next to the actual tomb, which would have its spirit path or shindo, right? And there will be a huge tablet erected right in front of the spirit path. By the way, that word shindo is the same as Shinto in Japanese, but it's a different thing. And that path to the tomb would be marked by this huge stele inscription, and the stele would basically tell you the great accomplishments of the owner of the tomb and the accomplishments, more importantly, of the family of the owner of the tomb. And that's why family histories were so important. So this entire package, this is what people were going for. So if you were someone, right, of elite status, and you wanted to really, right, exhibit and demonstrate and build upon and sustain that status, then what you had to do during the Goryeo period was to basically have this package, this elite package, right? But not many people could afford to do that. Now, the one question that we could perhaps ask is, why would anybody want to, why would Buddhist monasteries be the obvious choice here? Well, now think about it this way. I know this might sound a little odd, but if you entrust your post-mortem fate to your children and your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and so on, the people back then, right, several centuries ago, they knew what was going to happen. Your children and great-grandchildren are going to start to forget about you, and they're not going to perform the necessary rituals to make sure that you don't turn into a hungry ghost or something worse, right? So they knew that there was an institution that would guarantee that sacrifices would be made on their behalf in perpetuity. That's what a Buddhist monastery is. An endowment made to a Buddhist monastery, it was called a po back in the day, right? Practically guaranteed, because the monastery would actually use the interest made off of that endowment, not the actual the prime, right? The loan itself. They could, in theory, sustain the sacrifices for the dead in perpetuity. So in many ways, this relationship between Buddhism and the elite, this was a no-brainer, right? Now, with the coming of the Mongols, this only became more apparent because the Mongols themselves had converted to Buddhism, and I'm sorry to sort of go on a tangent here, but a lot of people say the Mongols were converted to Buddhism, and I just said that too. But conversion here is a little different from the way we typically use the term. The Mongols maintained all of the different customs that they encountered and they converted to. So it's not that you were on one day, a believer of Tengri, the supreme god of the Mongols, and then you convert to Buddhism. The Mongols were once, they worshiped Tengri, they continued to do so. They became Buddhist, and when they encountered Islam, they more than happily converted to Islam as well and maintained all of their faiths at the same time. Koreans during the Goryeo period did something remarkably similar, by the way. They didn't just belong to one faith or religion. But when the Mongols ruled over Korea during the Mongol overlordship period, the kinds of practices that the Goryeo elite had engaged in for centuries, that only got accentuated and exaggerated because it was remarkably similar to what the Mongols were going for as well. However, it's ironic that at the peak of Buddhist power, so to speak, right? Because now everybody wants to do it. And there's now a desperate need to do so because people who didn't come from elite backgrounds want to be elite. And the only way for them to acquire elite status was to behave like the elite, which meant that they needed to use their wealth to endow Buddhist monasteries and so on and so forth. It was ironically during this period that some started to basically ask, do we need to continue to do this? And it is during this period that we begin to see changes appearing in burial practices. And that's why I shared with you the story of the Assistant Chancellor Yuntek. He did something truly bizarre from the perspective of people who are familiar with the burial practices of the elites during the Goryeo period. If you were a member of a high-ranking official's family, right, who produced officials for generations, you did not go back home to the boonies to get buried. You had to be buried near the capital, and for good reason. You expected your children to be officials as well, and if your children and your grandchildren were officials, then if they're going to come to your graveside and perform graveside sacrifices, and your grave is far away from the capital, then you're taking your children and grandchildren away from their work, which you desperately did not want to do, which is why it was so important to have a plot of land and a memorial monastery right next to the capital. But Assistant Chancellor Yuntek didn't do that. He went all the way back home to Jeollado, actually, and that's as far as you can get from the capital. And he decided to perform mourning next to his mother's grave. And the hut that he built, his family turned into a graveside mourning shrine. And that custom was not something that we see prior to this period. And we know from records that I shared with you in today's talk that this was done on purpose. This family wanted to say that basically that the way we used to exhibit elite behavior, it's not working anymore and it's not worth it. So let's start to explore what really being an elite is all about. And what it meant to be an elite no longer meant being wealthy. It meant, and being Buddhist, it meant having virtue and exhibiting moral qualities, right? And this, they believed, men who came from backgrounds with no pedigree couldn't possibly possess, right? They lacked morality. Only really great families had morality and ethics and virtue. And they started to emphasize this. And the language is so remarkably similar to Neo-Confucianism. And that's, I think, why there's been so much talk about how Korea was converted to Neo-Confucianism, which led to the rise of the Joseon dynasty. That's not really what happened. What really happened was what I described in the talk with the arrival of the stranger king and people starting to have different ideas about the meaning of wealth. I hope that answered your question. I'm sorry that was such a long answer too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question?
Yeah, can I just talk from here?
Yeah, I think so. Just speak up so that the mic's right in front of you, so it'll pick it up.
So I used to give tours of Sungkyunkwan, and I'm familiar with its Confucian background there. But a couple of times I managed to go up to Kaesong in North Korea and visit the Sungkyunkwan there, which
Right.
is a similar structure. It basically seems, as far as I can tell, it's Confucian by nature. But right now it's a museum to Goryeo with not a single mention of Confucian traditions at all. But I mean, this does raise the point that those buildings were created during Goryeo, and I assume at the time they must have been based on some Confucian teachings with the, that's how the exam system was based, I think, back then too. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how that kind of institution fit in Goryeo, because I know virtually nothing about its Goryeo history.
Right. And thank you for that great question. I really envy you. I really wish I could visit Kaesong myself and haven't been able to do so. But yes, Sungkyunkwan is the highest institution of learning, and it was modeled after the institution that was in use in China. And it was a place where you learned the Confucian classics, and the Confucian classics were used for the civil service examination system, which was the exam that you need to pass to enter officialdom during the Goryeo period. So absolutely, in that regard, we can say that Goryeo, just like the Joseon period, was a Confucian state. But what's really interesting is Confucianism in this regard really was an extension of state policy. So in other words, the Goryeo state, just like its predecessor, and although there was Goryeo, Shilla, and Baekje, the three kingdoms, Goryeo really saw itself as the successor state to Shilla. So just like its predecessor Shilla, Goryeo wanted to adopt the government wanted to adopt a system whereby it could produce officials loyal to the king. And Confucianism was designed really around that concept, although it continued to demonstrate that it would fail miserably to produce officials loyal to the ruler. But at least in theory, that's what it was supposed to do. And so the Goryeo official system of recruiting officials, right? It was built on that. But the officials themselves, not necessarily in their capacity as officials, but as in their capacity as members of a native elite, they continue to rely on a custom that was perhaps even older, and that is the use of Buddhism to celebrate death, right? And make sure that the post-mortem destinies of their very special dead would be just that, very special. And so in a way, all throughout the Goryeo period, and this is the same for Shilla as well, there was a dual structure, so to speak, where on the one hand, when you're at work, you are duly a Confucian official. But in virtually all other aspects of life, if you needed to, take a leisurely trip to some wonderful place, it usually was a Buddhist monastery or hermitage. If you were going to prepare for death, that usually was a Buddhist monastery. If you needed terminal care, that was usually a Buddhist monastery. And if you needed to have somebody to have a very interesting, stimulating intellectual conversation with, you would think that it would be your fellow official friends, but often it was with a Buddhist monk who brought in the freshest and most exciting ideas from the continent. And so Buddhism, I would argue, constituted a much larger portion of an official and an elite's life during the Goryeo period. But in the limited capacity, right, as a Goryeo official, a member of the elite who happened to belong to the officialdom would exhibit all the traits that you would expect of somebody who was trained in Confucian learning, and that's what what Seongyungwan, the institution was for. So Goryeo had it, and it had continued to be used all throughout the Goryeo period. The Mongols even used it. In fact, at the beginning of the 14th century, they're going to adopt Neo-Confucianism, essentially, as a method to recruit officials into the officialdom. But that didn't really change the fact that in in almost all other aspects of life, the elites' lives were defined by their relationship to Buddhism. I hope that answers your question.
Seems like it did, yeah.
Yes, thank you. All right. Well, thank you all very much for being here. Juhn, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time. Good luck and best wishes on your upcoming trip. Hope that goes very well for you.
Thank you very much.
You stop. I have some announcements. Thank you.